You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, out of nowhere, and your phone buzzes 5 minutes later. It's them. You're wrestling with a difficult decision, and a total stranger on a train says the exact sentence you needed to hear. A book falls off a shelf in a bookstore you weren't even planning to visit, and lands open on the exact page that answers the question you'd been avoiding for weeks. You call it a coincidence and move on with your day. Carl Jung, one of the most influential minds in the history of psychology, spent decades of his career convinced that some of these moments are not random at all, and that dismissing them too quickly might be a mistake. He gave this phenomenon a name that most people have heard, but very few understand correctly. Synchronicity. Not fate, not magic, not the law of attraction, and not something you'll find explained accurately in most of the content that borrows his name today. Something far stranger and far more useful once you understand what he actually meant by it. And the story of how he arrived at it starts, of all places, with an insect trying to get into his office. Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, born in 1875, and he remains, alongside Sigmund Freud, one of the two founding figures of modern depth psychology. He is the reason we casually use words like introvert, extrovert, and archetype in everyday conversation, and one of the biggest reasons the entire field of psychology takes dreams, symbols, and the unconscious seriously as objects of study rather than nonsense to dismiss. Jung founded what he called analytical psychology, built around concepts like the collective unconscious, a layer of the mind he believed was shared across all humans rather than shaped purely by individual experience, and archetypes, recurring symbolic patterns he found showing up in dreams, myths, and religious traditions across cultures that had no historical contact with one another. For over a decade, Jung worked closely with Freud and was considered his most promising successor, to the point that Freud himself, according to well-documented correspondence between the two, referred to Jung as his intended heir for the psychoanalytic movement. But the two eventually split around 1913 over a fundamental disagreement about what drives the human mind. Freud insisted that the unconscious was shaped almost entirely by repressed sexuality and personal childhood trauma, while Jung became convinced that something larger and less personal was also at work underneath. That break cost Jung his professional home, his closest intellectual relationship, and several years of what he later described as a profound personal crisis. It also freed him to pursue the questions Freud's framework had no room for, and that split is exactly where the story of synchronicity begins. If you're new to this channel, this is where we take one real teaching from one real thinker and break down not just the idea, but how to actually use it. Subscribe if that's useful to you, because we do this every week. Freud believed the unconscious mind operated almost entirely through cause and effect. A repressed memory causes a symptom. A childhood event causes an adult behavior. Everything, in principle, could eventually be traced back to a prior cause. Jung respected that framework, but over years of clinical practice, he kept running into moments that causality simply couldn't explain. Patients would describe a dream, and something in the outside world would happen at almost the exact same time that mirrored it, with no possible causal link between the two. At first, Jung treated these moments the way any trained clinician would, as interesting but ultimately meaningless coincidences, probably explained by chance and by the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But the pattern kept repeating across different patients, different contexts, different years of his practice, until Jung became convinced that dismissing every single one of these events as pure chance was, itself, an intellectual shortcut. He didn't have a name for what he was seeing yet. He had a question that wouldn't leave him alone. What if some coincidences carry meaning not because they were caused by something, but because they happen to align with what a person is experiencing internally at that exact moment? This question put Jung in a genuinely uncomfortable position within his own field. Psychiatry in the early 20th century was working hard to establish itself as a rigorous, evidence-based medical discipline, distancing itself from anything that sounded like folklore or superstition. Suggesting that some events might be connected by meaning rather than by cause risked sounding to his more skeptical colleagues like a step backward into exactly the kind of unscientific thinking the field was trying to leave behind. Jung was aware of that risk, and by his own later admission, he sat on these observations for years, refining them privately, before he felt ready to publish anything about them formally. What made Jung take the question seriously rather than shelve it was that it connected to something he was already building. His theory of the collective unconscious, the idea that certain symbolic patterns and images show up across completely unrelated cultures because they're wired into the shared structure of the human mind, not because one culture copied another. If that theory held any water, Jung reasoned, it opened the door to a related possibility, that an individual's inner symbolic world might, under the right conditions, line up with events in the outer world in ways that weren't coincidental noise, but weren't ordinary cause and effect either. Synchronicity, in other words, wasn't a random idea he stumbled onto. It was the logical next question, raised by work he'd already spent years developing. This case, the one that Jung would later use in his own published writing to illustrate the idea of synchronicity, involved a patient he described as highly rational and resistant to anything that couldn't be explained logically. According to Jung's own account, published decades later in his essay Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle, this patient had reached a difficult point in her treatment. She understood the concepts intellectually, but something in her stayed closed off, unable to move forward emotionally. During one session, she was describing a dream from the night before, in which someone had given her an expensive piece of jewelry shaped like a golden scarab beetle. As she spoke, Jung, sitting with his back to a closed window, heard a faint tapping sound behind him. He turned, opened the window, and caught the insect that had been trying to get in. It was a rose chafer, a beetle with a metallic gold-green shell, about as close as it gets in that part of the world, to an actual golden scarab. According to Jung's own record of the moment, this species of beetle was not something that typically behaved this way. Rose chafers do not commonly seek out dark rooms or press themselves against closed windows trying to get inside, which is part of why the timing struck Jung as worth noting at all, rather than a mundane event he barely registered. He also later pointed out the symbolic weight already baked into the image itself. In ancient Egyptian tradition, the scarab was a symbol of rebirth and transformation, a detail neither Jung nor, as far as he recorded, his patient had been consciously thinking about when the dream and the insect converged. According to Jung's own record of the moment, he handed the insect to his patient and said only a few words, "Here is your scarab." It was a small, almost absurd event, but for a patient whose entire defense system was built on rational explanation, an event this specific, this well-timed, and this symbolically loaded broke through in a way that months of conventional interviewing had not. What mattered to Jung wasn't the insect itself, it was what the moment did to his patient's resistance. According to his own account, the improbability and the symbolic precision of the event was enough to crack open her rigid rationalism, and from that session onward, her treatment began to move forward again. Something about facing an event that logic couldn't fully explain, but that lined up so precisely with the exact content of her inner world, gave her permission to stop needing everything to make rational sense before she could trust it. Jung didn't use this case to argue that beetles carry messages or that the universe was rearranging insects to send her a sign. He used it to make a much more careful point, that some events, though not causally connected, are connected by meaning, and that meaning connection is not something a strictly cause and effect model of the mind can account for. This single clinical moment became the seed of a concept he would spend the next 3 decades refining, testing, and defending against considerable criticism from his own scientific community. It's worth pausing on how small this intervention actually was. Jung didn't deliver a lecture, didn't reinterpret the patient's dream in some elaborate new way, and didn't claim any special power over what had just happened. He simply named the coincidence out loud and let its weight do the work that months of conventional dialogue hadn't managed. That restraint is part of what makes the case worth studying. The technique wasn't the insect. The technique was noticing, out loud, that something meaningful had just happened, and trusting the patient to make sense of it herself. Jung eventually defines synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence between an inner psychological state and an outer event, where the two are not linked by cause and effect, but by the fact that they share the same meaning for the person experiencing them. This is the part almost everyone gets wrong when they hear the word casually. Synchronicity is not simply a coincidence. Every coincidence is, by definition, a chance alignment of two unrelated things. What makes something synchronistic, in Jung's specific sense, is that the alignment carries personal, symbolic significance for the observer at that exact moment, not that it happened at all. Thinking about your mother and then dialing a wrong number is a coincidence. Thinking intensely about your mother at the exact hour she is trying to reach you for the first time in years, right before you unknowingly pick up the phone to call her, carries a different weight according to Jung's framework, because the two events line up with something meaningful happening internally, not just externally. The distinction matters because it's the difference between a claim you can take seriously and a claim you can't. Jung was never arguing that the universe causes these events to happen. He was arguing that human beings are wired to notice and to be genuinely affected by alignments of meaning even when no causal link exists. In his own writing, Jung actually broke the phenomenon down into more than one category because he was careful not to lump every strange coincidence into a single bucket. The first and most common type, the one the scarab illustrates, is a meaningful alignment between an inner psychological state and an outside event happening at the same time and place. A second type he described involved a psychic image or thought corresponding to a distant event the person could not have known about through ordinary means, such as sensing something was wrong with a family member far away shortly before learning they had, in fact, been in danger at that moment. A third, more speculative category involved images or premonitions that seemed to correspond to something that would only happen in the future. Jung treated this third category with noticeably more caution than the first, aware that it strayed closest to territory no clinical or scientific method could responsibly verify. That distinction alone tells you something about how carefully he was actually thinking, rather than simply collecting spooky stories. He was willing to draw a line between what he felt reasonably confident describing and what he considered too speculative to defend. Here's what makes this idea genuinely useful rather than just academically interesting. Most people experience meaningful coincidences regularly and dismiss almost all of them within seconds. The modern explanation for why we notice patterns everywhere is well documented in cognitive psychology. The human brain is a pattern detection machine, constantly scanning for connections, and it tends to remember the hits while quietly discarding the thousands of misses. If you think of a song and it doesn't play on the radio, you forget it instantly. If it does play, you remember it for years. Psychologists sometimes call a closely related effect the frequency illusion, where once you become consciously aware of something, like a specific car model or a specific word, you suddenly start noticing it everywhere, not because it's actually appearing more often, but because your attention has been trained to catch it. Jung would not have disagreed with that explanation. In fact, he was aware of exactly this kind of statistical objection during his own lifetime, since it was raised repeatedly by scientific colleagues who considered synchronicity an embarrassing detour from serious psychology. What Jung added to the conversation wasn't a rejection of statistics. It was a question underneath the statistics. Even granting that most coincidences are meaningless noise, why do certain specific alignments consistently show up at psychologically decisive moments, in therapy, in grief, in major life transitions, more often than pure randomness alone would predict? He never claimed to have a final, provable answer to that question. He claimed it deserved to be studied instead of laughed off, and he spent real professional capital, at real risk to his scientific reputation, defending that position. Jung didn't develop this idea alone, and the person who helped him refine it gives the theory more intellectual weight than most people realize. Starting in the 1930s, Jung began a long correspondence and collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli, an Austrian theoretical physicist who had already won worldwide recognition for his exclusion principle, one of the foundational rules of quantum mechanics, and who would go on to receive the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1945. Pauli was not a fringe figure looking for mystical validation. He was one of the sharpest and most demanding minds in 20th century physics, known among colleagues like Einstein, Bohr, and Heisenberg as a ruthless critic of sloppy thinking, which is part of what makes his willingness to take Jung's ideas seriously so notable. Pauli, who was also a patient of Jung's for a period after a personal crisis of his own involving a difficult divorce and heavy drinking, became fascinated by the parallels between Jung's causal connections in psychology and the causal, probability-based nature of events at the quantum level, where outcomes are described statistically rather than by strict predictable cause and effect. The two exchanged letters for over 2 decades, a correspondence later published in English as Atom and Archetype, debating where the boundary sat between legitimate scientific analogy and unfounded speculation. In 1952, the two published a joint volume, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, pairing Jung's essay on synchronicity with an essay by Pauli on the role of intuition and archetype in the history of scientific discovery, using the astronomer Johannes Kepler as his case study. This collaboration doesn't prove that synchronicity is a law of physics. Serious historians of science are careful to note that the analogy between quantum causality and psychological meaning is exactly that, an analogy, not a mathematical equivalence. But it does show that Jung's idea was taken seriously enough by one of the sharpest physicists of the 20th century to spend 2 decades in correspondence about it, rather than dismissed outright as the kind of thing a rigorous scientist should ignore. It's worth being precise here, because this is exactly the point where modern self-help culture tends to hijack Jung's idea and turn it into something he never claimed. Synchronicity, in Jung's own framework, is not a promise that the universe is arranging events in your favor, and it is not a mechanism you can activate through positive thinking to manufacture outcomes, the way some popular manifestation content implies today. Jung was a clinician describing a pattern he observed in the therapy room, not a guru promising control over external events. There's a meaningful difference between saying notice when meaning and event line up and let that noticing do useful psychological work, and saying think positive thoughts hard enough and the universe will rearrange itself to deliver what you want. Jung's writing never supports the second claim, and conflating the two does a disservice to what was actually a careful, if unconventional, piece of clinical theorizing. It's the same trap that shows up in a lot of watered-down pop psychology. Take one real, documented observation, strip away all the caution the original thinker built around it, and sell the leftover certainty as a life hack. Jung himself would likely have found that version of his own idea a little embarrassing. The honest scientific position, then and now, is that synchronicity remains a psychological and philosophical framework, not an empirically proven force, and mainstream science has never validated it as a causal mechanism in the world. Statisticians and skeptical researchers have pointed out for decades that with billions of people experiencing millions of small coincidences every single day, a certain number of wildly improbable feeling alignments are not just possible, but mathematically guaranteed to happen to someone, somewhere, purely by chance, a principle sometimes referred to informally as the law of truly large numbers. What research in cognitive psychology has validated is something adjacent and genuinely practical, that noticing meaningful alignments, whatever their ultimate cause, can shift how a person interprets a difficult moment in their life the same way it did for Jung's own patient. That is a real, documented psychological effect. Treating it as proof of a hidden cosmic order is a much bigger claim than the evidence, or than Jung himself, ever supported. So what does this look like in practice, without sliding into pseudoscience? The most grounded way to apply Jung's idea is not to go looking for cosmic signs, but to pay closer attention when something aligns unusually well with a decision or an emotional state you're already sitting with, and to treat that alignment as an invitation to reflect, not as an instruction to obey. If a coincidence nudges you to finally call the friend you'd been avoiding or to reconsider a choice you'd been putting off, the value isn't in proving the universe orchestrated it. The value is in the reflection the moment triggers. There's a useful test you can borrow directly from how Jung treated his own cases. Ask whether the coincidence is doing real psychological work, or whether you're just using it to avoid making a decision yourself. A meaningful coincidence, in Jung's own therapeutic use of the concept, was never a substitute for the patient's own judgment. It was a doorway into a conversation the person was already having with themselves, whether they realized it or not. If you notice you're waiting for a sign, instead of making a call you already know you need to make, that's a very different use of the idea than the one Jung was describing, and it's worth being honest with yourself about the difference. Jung's own therapeutic practice offers the clearest model here, He never told his patient the scarab was a message from beyond. He used the moment as a doorway into a conversation she was already avoiding. That's the practical version of synchronicity that survives outside the therapy room. When something strange and well-timed happens, instead of rushing to either dismiss it as meaningless or inflate it into fate, sit with the question it's actually pointing at. The coincidence is rarely the point. What you were already wrestling with when it happened usually is. Jung spent 30 years defending an idea that most of his scientific peers considered an embarrassing lapse from a brilliant mind, and he did it not because he needed the universe to be magical, but because he trusted what he kept observing in the room with real patience more than he trusted the comfort of a tidy theory that explained everything through cause and effect. That, more than the scarab beetle itself, might be the real lesson. Staying curious about what doesn't fit your existing model, instead of forcing it to fit or throwing it away, is often where the most useful insights actually come from. It's easy to reduce Jung's entire career to either brilliant scientist or the guy who got a little too mystical toward the end. And both versions miss what actually made him valuable. He was willing to sit in the uncomfortable middle, taking seriously what he observed without needing to dress it up as proven fact. Most of us are trained to do the opposite, to either explain a strange moment away completely or to overinflate it into destiny, because the middle ground, just paying attention without needing a final answer, feels unsatisfying. Jung built an entire body of work and risked real professional standing out of refusing to take either shortcut. Next time something strange and well-timed happens to you, you don't have to call it fate, and you don't have to dismiss it either. Just ask what it's pointing you toward. If this kind of breakdown of real ideas from real thinkers is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're covering the specific kind of encounter Jung believed changes a person permanently. What happens when you meet your own opposite reflected back at you in someone else? Drop a comment with a coincidence that felt meaningful to you. It might be more interesting than you think.